February 26, 1945. The ruined streets of Elsdorf, Germany, just beyond the Ruhr River. The morning fog clung to the broken cobblestones like a funeral shroud. Smoke from the previous night's bombardment still drifted between the skeletal remains of what had once been bakeries and bookshops. The air tasted of burnt wood and cordite. In the turret of a Panther Ausfg, Oberleutnant Werner Wolf scanned the rubble-choked intersection ahead, his breath misting in the frigid air. He had fought from Kursk to the Rhine, survived 3 years of the Eastern Front's frozen hell, and lived through the summer cauldrons where entire divisions vanished in fire. His Panther was a proven killer. 75mm gun, sloped armor designed to deflect shells like rain off a roof. A reputation forged in the wreckage of Soviet T-34s and American Shermans. As his driver idled the Maybach engine, Wolf felt the familiar weight of inevitability. The Americans were coming. They always came. But they came in Shermans, those tall, ungainly coffins that burned so easily the Germans called them Ronsons. One strike, and they light every time. Wolf had killed 11 of them. He expected to kill more today, 3 blocks away. In the commander's cupola of a machine Wolf had never seen before, First Lieutenant Frank Audefred of the 3rd Armored Division peered through his periscope at the same intersection. Beneath him sat 46 tons of American engineering that had arrived in Europe only 6 weeks earlier. So new that many Wehrmacht intelligence officers did not believe it existed. The M26 Pershing heavy tank. Its 90mm gun protruded like the arm of judgment, longer and thicker than anything the Americans had fielded before. The armor was thick, 4 inches on the glacis, sloped at 46 degrees. The silhouette was low, predatory, nothing like the high-profile Shermans that had bled across France. Audefred's crew was exhausted, hungry, and a long way from home. But they were also curious. They had trained on this machine for only a handful of weeks. They had been told it could fight Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. Now, in the shattered arteries of a dying Reich, they would learn if that was true. For 3 years, American armor doctrine had been built on a gamble that was proving lethal. The Sherman medium tank had been designed for mobility and mass production, not for tank versus tank duels. The assumption had been that American tank destroyers and air superiority would handle enemy armor, while Shermans supported infantry and exploited breakthroughs. But the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes had shattered that illusion. Shermans faced Panthers and Tigers in close-range ambushes where air support was useless, and tank destroyers were too slow to respond. The results were predictable and horrific. A Sherman's 75mm gun could barely penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at 500 yards. A Panther could kill a Sherman at 2,000. American crews learned to fight in packs, to flank, to sacrifice 2 or 3 tanks to kill 1 German. They learned to aim for tracks and barrels, to call in artillery, to pray. They also learned to burn. The casualty rates told the story with brutal arithmetic. In Normandy, American armored divisions suffered losses approaching 50%. Crews that survived one tank often found themselves reassigned to another, climbing into a replacement Sherman, knowing the odds were stacked against them. The tankers developed dark humor and darker rituals. Some refused to learn the names of replacement crewmen until they had survived a week. Others kept count of how many times they had bailed out of burning vehicles. The smell became a constant companion. That sweet, nauseating mixture of burning rubber, diesel, and flesh that clung to their uniforms and invaded their dreams. Requests for a heavy tank, something that could stand toe-to-toe with German armor, had been flowing up the chain of command since 1943. But doctrine, bureaucracy, and the industrial momentum of Sherman production had delayed the response. By the time the Pershing finally arrived in January 1945, tens of thousands of American tankers had already paid the price for that delay. The Pershing was not supposed to exist. Not yet. The Ordnance Department had spent years arguing that a heavy tank was unnecessary, that it would strain logistics, that the Sherman was adequate. But the Sherman was not adequate, and the men dying in them knew it. The Pershing's development had been a bureaucratic battle almost as fierce as the fighting in Europe. It carried a 90mm gun adapted from anti-aircraft artillery, the same weapon mounted on the M36 tank destroyer. The gun could fire a 17-pound armor-piercing shell at 2,800 feet per second, fast enough to punch through 4 inches of hardened steel at 1,000 yards. The armor layout borrowed principles from German design, sloped plates that increased effective thickness without adding weight. The silhouette was deliberately low to reduce target profile. Everything about the Pershing's design was a response to German armor doctrine, an admission that the enemy had been right about something fundamental. In armored warfare, the tank that saw first and killed first was the tank that survived. Werner Wolf did not know any of this as his Panther eased around the corner into the Elsdorf intersection. He saw the American tank, and his mind performed the calculation it had performed 100 times before. Sherman, 75mm gun. Vulnerable. He began issuing orders to his gunner, the familiar litany of range and deflection. But something was wrong. The silhouette was different. Lower. The gun was enormous, its muzzle brake unmistakable even through the smoke and dust. Wolf's voice caught in his throat as realization struck. This was not a Sherman. This was something else, something new. He shouted for his gunner to fire now, immediately. But the Pershing had already seen them. Audefred's gunner, Corporal John Grimball, had the Panthers centered in his sight. The range was close, perhaps 300 yards, near point blank by armor standards. Grimball laid the crosshairs on the Panther's hull, just below the turret ring where the armor was thickest, but also vertical, and squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun roared, the massive recoil shaking the Pershing's frame. The armor-piercing round crossed the distance in a fraction of a second and struck the Panther with the force of a meteor. The German tank's frontal armor, 80mm thick and sloped, had deflected countless Sherman rounds. It did not deflect this one. The shell punched through, penetrated the crew compartment, and detonated the ammunition stored beside the driver. The Panther exploded from within, its turret lifting several feet into the air before crashing back down at an angle. Fire vomited from every hatch and vision port. Wolf never had time to give the order to bail out. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. For the American crew, it was a revelation. The Pershing had done what Sherman's could not. It had killed a Panther with a frontal shot at medium range, the exact scenario that had been a death sentence for American armor since Normandy. Audefred's crew sat in stunned silence for a moment, the acrid smell of gun smoke filling the turret. Before the reality sank in, they had won. Not by flanking, not by calling in artillery, not by sacrificing another tank to create an opening. They had won because their gun was bigger and their armor was thicker. They had won the way the Germans had been winning for 3 years. Word of the engagement spread through the 3rd Armored Division with the speed of wildfire. The Pershing had arrived. Crews who had spent months fighting with one hand tied behind their backs suddenly had a weapon that changed the equation. In the weeks that followed, more Pershings arrived at the front, 20 in total by war's end. A pitifully small number compared to the thousands of Shermans, but their psychological impact far outweighed their numbers. Wherever a Pershing appeared, it drew German fire like a magnet, not because it was vulnerable, but because German tank commanders recognized the threat. Engagement reports from February and March 1945 document Panthers and Tigers breaking off attacks when Pershings were spotted, a behavior almost unheard of earlier in the war. The Predator had learned to fear. For the German tank crews, the Pershing represented a cruel inversion of their strategic reality. For years, they had fought outnumbered but technologically superior, their Panthers and Tigers dominating the battlefield even as they were overwhelmed by sheer Allied numbers. The implicit bargain had been this: we may lose the war of production, but we will never lose the war of quality. The Panther was better than the Sherman. The Tiger was better than anything the Allies fielded. This superiority was not merely tactical, it was ideological, a confirmation of German engineering excellence and martial virtue. The arrival of the Pershing shattered that bargain. Here was an American tank that could fight a Panther on equal terms, perhaps even superior terms. And if the Americans could build one, they could build 1,000. The industrial might that had already buried the Wehrmacht in Shermans, Thunderbolts, and artillery shells could now produce a weapon that matched German quality. The last advantage was slipping away. The Pershing became a symbol of something larger than its battlefield performance. It represented the final maturation of American industrial and military power. The United States had entered the war with inadequate tanks, outdated doctrine, and untested crews. It had suffered humiliating defeats in North Africa and costly stalemates in Italy. But it had learned. It had adapted. It had taken the lessons written in the blood of Sherman crews and forged them into a weapon that could challenge the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. The 90mm gun was not just a bigger cannon. It was the physical manifestation of American flexibility, the willingness to admit error and correct it, to abandon doctrine when doctrine failed. The Germans had built their armor in the late 1930s and early 1940s, then spent the war perfecting variations on the same themes. The Americans had built new weapons mid-war, responding to battlefield realities rather than pre-war assumptions. The Pershing was late, far too late for the tens of thousands who had died in Shermans, but it was not too late to prove a point. In the rubble of German cities, as the Reich collapsed around them, tank crews on both sides experienced the war's final transformation. For the Americans, the Pershing offered a glimpse of what could have been. A tank that did not require suicidal courage to operate. A machine that gave its crew a fighting chance. For the Germans, it was a confirmation of what they had always feared, that American abundance would eventually produce not just quantity, but quality. That the industrial colossus they had mocked in 1941 would learn to forge weapons as deadly as their own. The 90mm gun became a harbinger, a preview of the Cold War arsenal that would follow. The Pattons, the M60s, the Abrams, each generation larger and more lethal than the last. Lieutenant Audefred survived the war. He returned to Louisiana, worked as a civil engineer, and kept a photograph of his Pershing crew on his desk until the day he died. In interviews decades later, he spoke carefully about the Elsdorf engagement, choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that he had killed other men, that his survival had been purchased with their deaths. He did not celebrate. He did not boast, but he also did not apologize. The Pershing had given him and his crew a chance to go home. The Panther crew had not been afforded the same. Werner Wolf's family received notification of his death in April 1945, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender. His mother kept his letters, tied with string, in a drawer for the rest of her life. In one, written in January 1945, he described the growing sense of futility, the knowledge that the war was lost, but the fighting continued anyway. He wrote about the new American tanks he had heard rumors of, larger and more dangerous than the Shermans. He wrote that he was tired. The letter ended with a line that his mother underlined in pencil, returning to it again and again in the years after. "We built the best machines in the world, but they built more, and now they have built better." It was not a surrender, merely an observation. But observations, in the end, mattered more than propaganda. By the time the war ended, the Pershing had participated in fewer than a dozen major engagements. Its combat record was impressive but limited. Only 20 Pershings saw action before Germany's surrender, and none were lost to enemy fire. The 90mm gun had proven capable of defeating any German tank it encountered, and the armor had withstood hits that would have destroyed a Sherman. But the Pershing's true victory was not measured in kill ratios or armor penetration statistics. It was measured in the shift it represented, the closing of a technological gap that had cost thousands of lives. The Pershing announced that America had learned the lessons of armored warfare, that it would no longer send its sons to die in inadequate machines, that abundance could be paired with excellence. The 90-millimeter gun outlived the Pershing. It equipped American tanks through Korea, served as coastal defense artillery, and was adapted for use in self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. The Pershing itself evolved into the M46 Patton, then the M47, each iteration refining the template established in those desperate winter weeks of 1945. The lineage stretched forward into the Cold War and beyond. A direct line from the Elsdorf intersection to the tank battles of the future. The 90-millimeter gun was the bridge between the war America entered and the war it finished, between the nation that built Shermans in haste and the superpower that would dictate the terms of armored combat for generations. On a cold February morning in a ruined German town, two tanks met in an intersection. One carried the weight of 3 years' dominance, the confidence of superior engineering, and the fading hope of a lost cause. The other carried the weight of hard lessons learned, of doctrine revised in blood, of industrial power finally matched with battlefield necessity. The engagement lasted 30 seconds. The echo lasted decades. The 90-millimeter gun spoke once, and in that roar was a message that reverberated across the wreckage of the Third Reich. That adaptability is a weapon as potent as steel, that learning is survival, that a nation willing to admit its mistakes and correct them will outlast one that cannot. The Pershing arrived late to the war. Too late for many, but not too late to prove that excellence and abundance need not be enemies. In the hands of exhausted American crews, the 90-millimeter gun became more than artillery. It became an answer to the question that had haunted every Sherman commander since Normandy. What if we had something better? The answer, when it finally came, was forged in American factories, crewed by American citizens, and delivered with the finality of a judgment long delayed. The Germans had built the best machines in the world, but the Americans had built better.